Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to lecture number 23 of Software Engineering 1 CSC 291. In today's lecture we will be covering our final topic on software design, and today we'll be covering user interface design. If you guys remember, in the last two lectures we covered architecture design, and then we moved on to object and class design or object-oriented design. In today's lecture we will be covering user interface design. So the main things that we will be discussing as when you make a software, how do you let user interact with the software. Okay, what kind of GUI or graphical user interface you design, or if the software needs a command prompt interface, then how would you design that? So but before we begin today's lecture and before we see what we are going to cover in today's lecture, let's quickly recap. Let's have a recap of our last lecture. So in the last lecture, as I already said, we covered object-oriented design. Okay, now when we covered object-oriented design, that's basically an approach of design so that the design components have their own private state and operations. And if you guys remember, we said that each object or each class, it has a state which is basically represented by the values that each variable has, and it has a set of operations. And these set of operations, they let other objects interact with this particular object. For example, when one object wants to interact with another object, he will send a message, and the receiving object basically will perform some operation and do the job, whatever the message was, whatever message was sent to this particular object. And each object, it should have a constructor and inspection operation. They provide services to other objects. Now what does a constructor does? Constructor lets other objects create this particular object, okay, and inspection lets inspect the state of particular object. Okay, and then we saw that these objects, they may be implemented sequentially or concurrently. Sequentially is pretty straightforward, that you have an object, then you create another object through that particular object. When you pass a message, you create another object. And concurrently, we saw an example of Java where we have threads. Okay, and we saw that with this threads object, they run as processes. Okay, and we saw an example of a transponder object, which we said that it keeps on calculating the location of an aircraft by getting data from different satellites and then performing some triangulation to get the accurate position of the aircraft. So these objects, they keep on running continuously. And what is important with these thread objects, or with these concurrent objects, that they need an operation which is basically run. So they need an operation which basically is continuously running, or it's running in an infinite loop. Okay, then we saw that when we have to create these models, then there are different ways of creating object-oriented models, but UML is kind of a de facto standard. Okay, so whenever we say that we are going to make an object-oriented design, the first thing that comes in our mind is Unified Modeling Language, or UML. Okay ji, then we saw that there is a range of models that can be created, or they basically help us in understanding object-oriented design. Okay, we saw that there are different categories of these models. We categorize them as static and dynamic system models. In terms of static models, we saw they only represent what are the different objects in a solution and their associations. Whereas when we talk about dynamic models, then the example of dynamic models is your sequence diagrams, your state charts, and maybe your collaboration diagrams as well. Okay. Then another thing that we covered in the last lecture is that the object interfaces should be defined precisely. Okay, the reason why they should be defined precisely is because we want to control the communication to our object from the outside world. Okay, because that is one of the design principles that we covered, that we want to hide the information. Okay, and we want to control the interfaces that our objects provide to the outside world. Okay, and then we covered what are the advantages, and how object-oriented design, it helps in design evolution. And we saw in the last lecture that when we studied the example of weather station, that the weather station, it was calculating different values. It was calculating the wind speed, it was calculating the ground temperature, and it was calculating different values, but it was not calculating air quality. Okay, and how do you measure air quality? By measuring the pollution in the air. Okay, so what we did, we added another class, and we said this is another object, and through this object we will get some other kind of data through which we will be able to calculate air quality. So object-oriented design, it simplifies, or it helps in design evolution. We can create a new object and we can make it part of our solution, and then we'll say, okay, our basic program, it performs another functionality. Okay, so that was what we covered in the object-oriented design lecture. Now let's come to today's lecture. First of all, let's see what are the objectives. What should you have in mind when you listen to this lecture? What we'll do, we will suggest some general design principles for user interface design. We will explain different interaction styles, because as I said, user interface is concerned, as the name suggests, user interface, that how the users will interface with the software. Okay, so we will try to identify different interaction styles. How do people interact with different software? And to introduce styles of information presentation, to describe the user support which should be built into user interface, to introduce usability attributes and system approaches to system evaluation. Now, user interface, it's a very interesting thing. Now, with the range of devices that we have in the market, user interface for different devices, it will vary. Okay, for example, you're making an application for desktop, okay, and it's a desktop application, it's not a web application. The interface would be totally different. Okay, whereas if you're making an application for a smartphone, let's say for Android operating system or for iOS, then the device that you intend to deploy it on, if it's a smartphone, then the screen is much smaller. So the user interface that you have to design that keeping in mind that. So basically, with the range of devices in the market that we have, user interface has lots and lots of importance. In fact, I was going through a very interesting blog, and the guy, he was a application developer, and he said that he was making applications for a while, and he said that my applications, they were functionally very accurate, and they used to perform very well, but the competitors' application, they were able to sell more applications or more licenses. The reason was their user interface, or their graphical user interface, or their design was so interactive and so helpful that people thought they are performing well. So at times, user interface is so important that if you design it well, then people would be attracted to your application. Okay, so there's a lot of importance for creating good user interface, or enabling user to interact with your software in a effective manner. Okay, ji. So what are the topics that we are going to cover today? We will cover user interface design principles. We will see how user interact with our software, with the applications. Then we have information presentation, that how do you actually present some information. I mean, you can write, for example, you have a website, okay, and the interface that you can design, you can divide it into different fields. For example, you must have seen their websites. They would normally have pages like introduction page, about us page, contact us page. Now they have basically spread the information across different categories. Now what they can do, they can basically put all the information in one page and be done with it. Okay, but the reason why they do it is because they want to make it more readable, they want to make it more interesting. Okay, and they want to they want to present the information in a good manner. And what do we mean by user support with user interface? We will look into that. And finally, interface evaluation. How do we evaluate that whether an application, it has a good interface or a bad interface? Okay, ji. So what is a user interface or the user interface? System users often judge a system by its interface rather than its functionality. And this is the point that I was telling you about, the story about that guy who basically said that the competitor's application, they were able to sell more applications. So this is the point, that at times people judge an application through its user interface. Okay, because we don't know how well the functionality is implemented by a certain software. Okay, for example, we get a new application and it's very flashy, and it has all the very nice images, and it has all very beautiful windows. It performs different the windows has shadows. When they pop up, they look very interesting. We'll say, okay, that's a brilliant software. Okay, because we don't know how the functionality has been implemented in that particular software. So the first thing that user sees for a certain application is the user interface. Okay, so that's where you get the user. Okay, so there is a lot of importance to a good user interface. And the second point, it emphasizes that a poorly designed interface can cause a user to make catastrophic errors. Okay, if your interface is not good enough, then people can make errors when they use their software. And we say catastrophic errors because depending on the severity where the application is being used, it can cause these kind of errors. And the third reason is that the poor user interface is the reason why so many software systems are never used. This is very interesting point, that if a user interface doesn't allows the user to use the software in a friendly manner, okay, that the people would not use it, people would not want to use it, okay. At times people are actually forced to use something, okay, but they do not want to use it. And then if you do detailed studies or detailed surveys, you will actually figure out that people, they only do it because they are forced to do it, and they just do bare minimum with it, okay. So they do not put a lot of effort to do all the things that are required of them, but they do bare minimum to just get done with it. Okay ji. And now moving on to graphical user interface. How we define graphical user interface? Most users of business systems interact with these systems through graphical interfaces, although in some cases legacy text-based interfaces are still used. Okay, mostly and normally, I mean, all the softwares that we use these days, I'm talking about a normal user like me and you guys sitting at home, we do have a graphical user interface. Okay, for example, when we perform a search on a website, we do not write an SQL query. Okay, we just write the name of the book, or we write the name of the movie or whatever we are trying to search on Google, and we just press enter, and at the back end, all the it must run some query to get that data from databases or wherever. Okay, so we are not concerned with the functionality, whereas we are concerned with the graphical user interface, that how the information is presented to us and how the application allows us to use or to perform certain functionality. You must have heard this word GUI. Okay, and you saw in the last slide we covered graphical user interface. So if we take all the initials of these three words, Z, U and I, so it becomes GUI. So we call, in this lecture, and mostly graphical user interface is referred by GUI. So what are the GUI characteristics? What are the different things? We have windows in a GUI, we have icons, we have menus, we have pointing, and then we have some graphics in it. So what do we mean by windows? It's multiple windows. They allow different information to be displayed simultaneously on the user's screen. And then we have icons, different types of information. On some systems, icon, they represent files. On others, icon represent processes. I mean, if you use Windows, then you have icons for basically everything. If you have Microsoft Word documents, okay, then you have icons for that. And then if you your applications, okay, there are different applications, all the executables, you can say them, these are different processes. And then you have menus, and these are basically commands are selected from a menu rather than typed in a command language. Okay, for example, we are using Microsoft Office, or we are using some other application, we do get these menus where we have file in which we can open a new window, we can create a new document, we can close, and we can open a recently used document. So these are the examples of menus. And then we have pointing, which, for example, we use a mouse to basically point to these different icons or point to these menus. So a pointing device such as a mouse is used for selecting choices from a menu or indicating items of interest in a window. And then we have some graphics, okay, and these graphic elements can be mixed with text on the same display. Okay, so we can include graphics to make our user interface more interesting. So there are 5 different characteristics that we attach or we associate with GUI. We have windows, we have icons, we have menus, pointing, and then we have some graphics. Okay, now let's see what are the different advantages of this GUI. Why did people thought that we need to have this graphical user interface? I mean, we can obviously think of lot of very interesting examples. Okay, we will discuss them. Let's see what are the different advantages of GUI. And number one is they are easy to learn and use. Users without experience can learn to use the system quickly. I mean, this is something very interesting. Now, if you guys look at your home, and our parents who are not very experienced computer users, but they are still able to log on to computers, and they are able to turn on Skype, and they are able to talk to their family members, and they are able to check their emails. And why they have been able to do so? I'm sure if we were using systems where they had to write all the commands and they had to type everything in DOS, they wouldn't be using it. What is the change which has basically enabled them to actually use these applications is GUI. Okay, the reason is because they know how a Skype icon looks like, or they know how to open Internet Explorer or Firefox or Google Chrome, because they know, okay, this particular icon they have associated that with the browser. Okay, so they just open it, and they check their emails and stuff. So basically this GUI, it helps non-experienced or people with less experience. They even enable them to use certain applications. and the user may switch quickly from one task to another and can interact with several different applications. I mean, this is something that we do normally. When I use my system, I have, I think, I don't know, 10 and 20 different applications running simultaneously, or 20 different folders open at the same time, and I switch between different folders. I switch between, in fact, now if you look at these browsers, you have Firefox, Internet Explorer, Google Chrome. When we use these softwares, we have the option of tabs, okay? And you can open new tabs, and at a time in Firefox, people have multiple tabs open at a time, okay? Now, I normally have 10 or 15 or maybe more tabs open at one time, okay? So basically, the user interface, it enables us as users to do multiple stuff at the same time, okay? We do not have to switch and type a different command to actually do that. We just use our pointing device, and we jump from one window to another window and do different multiple stuff at the same time. And how it enables that the information remains visible in its own window when attention is switched. So basically, I mean, even if we forget what we were doing, when we come back to this window, the information is still there. So it basically helps us know what we were doing. Okay, and then fast full screen interaction is possible with immediate access to anywhere on the screen, okay? Because you see that through these pointing devices, you can access any part of the screen. So you have basically the whole screen which you can use to represent information. Whereas in case of when you were typing commands, then there was just one line. For example, you were using DOS, then there's just command prompt where you can write one command, and you just wait for that. Whereas when you have this whole window, then the space is big enough. For example, you have your Windows desktop. Now the whole desktop, it can have maybe hundreds of icons, okay? So these are all the applications that you can use simultaneously by just one click of your mouse, okay? So these are the different advantages of graphical user interface. Okay, so when we are designing, we want to create design which is user-centered, okay? Because we make applications, and unless and until people don't use it, then our application would not be a success. So when we are designing, our design should be user-centered. So what do we mean by that? The important thing here to note is that our goal is to sensitize software engineers, me and you guys, to key issues underlining the design rather than the implementation of user interfaces, okay? So user-centered design is an approach to user interface design where the needs of the user are paramount, okay, and where the user is involved in the design process, okay? Now, what is the, we have already covered our analysis lectures. So what do you guys think? I will give you a pause of few seconds. So what do you guys think is the artifact or a diagram that we have made which help us know, or which will help us in designing a user interface? So what do you guys think? Okay, I think most of you would have figured out one of the diagrams that we have discussed which will help us in knowing how the user will interact with the application are the use case diagrams, okay? Because the use case diagrams, they tell us how different users will interact with our application. So we get through that diagrams the end user, what is his interest in this application, and when we are designing the user interface, we need to keep that in mind. So we say that end user, they are part of this design process. And user interface design, it always involves the development of prototype interfaces, okay? Now we've covered the prototype model, and we know what do we mean by prototype. By prototype, we mean that we make something and we get it verified by the customer. So because user interface is very, very key to a success of any product, then you create these prototype interfaces and you discuss them with the customer, and once the customer approves a certain interface, you can, okay, we'll go ahead with that, okay? So this is very common when you're designing these graphical user interfaces. So we do create these prototype interfaces. Okay ji, so what is the user interface design process? To begin with, the first activity that we perform is analysis and understand user activities. Now what are the different things user would do with the system, and as I already said that we can use the use case diagrams and they help us in knowing that. And then we produce paper-based design prototype. Okay, why we say paper-based? Because it's very easy to draw sketches and to roughly know what the user would want, okay? And we call it normally the design prototype because that is the first prototype that we make, and that is on the paper. And through this paper prototype, I mean, this graph is something which is interesting, that it shows that this is an iterative process. You don't get it right the first time, okay? So as we discussed with the design lectures, that design is an iterative activity. We saw it with object-oriented design, we saw it with architecture design, that you actually keep on improving it. Okay. So we produce the paper-based design prototype, and the artifact that we get is this design prototype. And what we do is, then we try to evaluate the design with the end users. Okay, because we are creating user-centered design. Okay, and for example, the user has some feedbacks for us, and he wants some things to be improved. Then this arrow, you can come back here and make the desired changes, and then you can come back here again. And once the design prototype is according to the user recommendations, this paper prototype, you basically pass it on to the next activity, which is produce dynamic design prototype. Okay, and this is an executable prototype. Okay, so basically you make the front end of the application, the back end or the functionalities, they are not working, but you make the front end. Okay, and again, this is a prototype, this is not something final. So you basically again go and ask the customer or the end user, not the customer, end user. You need to keep in mind that we need to discuss them with the end user. Okay, so we go and discuss that with the end user again, and again we follow the same process. End user, he may have some recommendations, then he would ask us to make some changes, and then we come back here again, we solve these problems, and then our design is finalized, and then we implement the final user interface. Okay, so what is the design process? We saw that user interface के design process के अंदर क्या-क्या चीजें involved हैं. Number one is that we analyze how the user or what activities the user want to perform with our application, and on the basis of that we make a paper based design. और जब हम paper based design से तो उससे हमारी artifact क्या आ जाती है? We get a paper based design prototype, or we get a design prototype which is sketched or drawn on the paper, and then we get it verified by the customer, not the customer, by the end user. Okay, and once that design prototype is according to the end user wishes, we go and produce a executable prototype, and again we get it verified by the end user, and once it is according to the wishes of the end user, we create the final user interface. So this is the steps that we should follow when we are creating a user interface, because we want to create a user-centered design. Okay, now that is another part of our lecture that we wanted to cover, the user interface design principles. So we will talk about that. What are the things that we need to keep in our mind when we're creating user interface? Okay, so number one is user interface design must take account of the needs, experience and capabilities of system users. Okay, now a very good example here would be that I mean, there are different level of users operating different kinds of applications. For example, if we talk about a very sophisticated application, let's say SAP. Okay, now SAP is a ERP system, and it basically it's a huge software. Okay, and I wouldn't expect a very novice user to be able to actually even go and do a very small thing in it, and people has to get properly trained to actually use that. Now that is an example of a software which is designed for very experienced user, or that is very domain specific. Okay, whereas if you look at a very simple problem, let's say you are trying to buy a ticket through touch machine, then normally there they have icons, or there they have images. Okay, why images? Because people can associate information with the images. Okay, and there they have touch screens. Okay, why touch screens? Because people would say, okay, I want to buy this ticket, they would just press they would just use their finger to select that, and so on and so forth. And why that? Because that particular application is designed for all users. Okay, there can be very experienced users, there can be people who have never used computers, they would also use that. Okay, so it depends. We need to keep in our mind that the application that we are going to make, whether it will be for very experienced people, or what will be the capability of an average end user. Okay, and then designers should be aware of the people's physical and mental limitations. Okay, for example, limited short-term memory, and should recognize that people make mistakes. Okay, now when you are designing this user interface, it should be good enough. Okay, it should be designed by keeping in view that the people they might have some physical and mental limitations. Okay, now if that is the case, then the user interface should reflect that, and it should be designed in a way that everybody can use that. Okay, then you have the user interface design principles underlie interface designs, although not all the principles are applicable to all designs. Okay ji. So what are the different design principles? Okay, we'll discuss them one by one. So number one is user familiarity. Okay, the interface should use terms and concepts which are drawn from the experience of the people who will make most use of the system. This is very interesting. Now if you're making an application for a normal factory worker, okay, जिसको शायद इंग्लिश भी नहीं आती, ओके, नाउ दैट इज़ वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग कि जब आप उसके लिए वो एक एप्लीकेशन बना रहे हैं तो मे बी द यूजर इंटरफेस इट शुड बी इन उर्दू, ठीक है, और दे शुड बी इमेजेस रादर देन इंग्लिश वर्ड्स बिकॉज ही वुड नॉट रिकग्नाइज व्हाट इज रिटन हियर. ओके, तो हमें यूजर की फेमिलियरिटी को जहन में रखना बहुत ज़रूरी है कि जिस बंदे ने एक्चुअली इस सॉफ्टवेयर को यूज़ करना है, वेदर ही विल बी फेमिलियर विद द थिंग्स दैट वी आर राइटिंग ऑन द स्क्रीन, ठीक, या इफ देयर आर सम टेक्निकल वर्ड्स or there are very specific words that they use for different things, then maybe we should include them in the user interface. Okay, क्योंकि उससे it will make their life very easy and they would want to actually use the software because then they will be able to associate, okay जी हम इसको इस तरह से कहते थे और इन्होंने ऐसे ही बनाया हुआ है. Okay, so they would be able to relate their normal routine with the application that you designed for them. Okay, and then the second design principle is consistency. ठीक है, the interface should be consistent in that wherever possible comparable operations should be activated in the same way. Okay, this is very important कि consistency it should be there. आप अगर एक application consistency के different meanings हो सकते हैं. For example, you have different windows, ठीक है, एक window आपकी लाल रंग में आ रही है, दूसरी पीले में आ रही है, तीसरी नीले में आ रही है. Now that is not consistency, ठीक है. इसी तरह consistency की दूसरी example क्या है कि for example you are performing search, ठीक है. Now there should be a standard way of performing search, ठीक है. ये ना हो कि एक दफ़ा आप सर्च करने ऑपरेशन करने जा रहे हैं तो देयर इज समथिंग टोटली डिफरेंट. जिस तरह इसकी एग्जांपल बड़ी इंटरेस्टिंग सी ली जा सकती है, जिस तरह व्हेनेवर यू ओपन अ न्यू विंडो in Windows or whenever you using Microsoft Office, ठीक है, normally you see there are some standard menus, ठीक है, so they have design consistency, they have file menu, ठीक है, they have all the menus, they are the same. The reason why they are the same across Office and across Windows because, and in fact most of the application they normally have a file menu, they normally have a help menu. The reason is that people know that there would be these two menus there, ठीक है, or there would be a menu of edit there, or there would be a menu of options there, ठीक है. So लोगों ने पहले ही तो they want to create products which are consistent, ठीक है, so that people can, if I am using a software, I should be able to figure out a certain feature of the product, ठीक है. So that's why we want to have design consistency. Okay, and minimal surprise, ठीक है. Users should never be surprised by the behavior of a system. This is very important. Okay, whenever I'm using the software, so I want to know what the software would do when I press a certain button, ठीक है. I should not be surprised, oh ये क्या हो गया, ठीक है. Whenever this happens, then the user would he would be shocked and he would be not very comfortable with using that particular software. And then another design principle is recoverability. The interface should include mechanisms to allow user to recover from errors. Okay, जिस तरह either that can be through some operations or for example you have submitted something now and you figured out, okay, no, there was something wrong. So the application, it has an functionality which allows you to go back and fix the problem and stuff like that. And then there should be user guidance. The interface should provide meaningful feedback when errors occur and provide context-sensitive user help facilities. जैसा normally आपने देखा होगा बहुत सी product के अंदर help का menu होता है जिसके अंदर you can search different things, so you can basically figure out कि जी ये field के अंदर आपने क्या डालना था, or you can have some small text written alongside different fields which would tell कि जी इस field के अंदर आपने सिर्फ numerics डालने हैं, क्या डालना है, So normally you can provide guidance to the user which will make it easy for them to use your application. Okay, and then we have final design principle which is user diversity. The interface should provide appropriate interaction facilities for different types of system users. Okay, now your application should cater that if there are different kinds of users and you can differentiate the functionality. If more experienced people would perform these kind of functions, So maybe their interaction with the application would be different. Okay, so you need to keep in mind the user diversity. So you need to know, okay, what are the different categories of end users. So you need to keep that in mind when you are designing the interface of your application. Okay, Ji. Now let's have some formal definitions of these and see some examples. Okay, so user familiarity. What do we say? What do we mean by that? The interface should be based on user-oriented terms and concepts rather than computer concepts. Okay, for example, an office system should use concepts such as letters, documents, folders, etc., rather than directories, file, and identifiers. Okay, this is something very interesting. Okay, when you say directory or a file or identifier, though normally जो office में एक बंदा काम करता है, he would not associate them with the words that they use in their normal routine. Whereas if you say documents and folders and letters, then they would quickly pick up, okay, this is what we do normally in this office, and this application is using the same words. So they would be they would like to use that application then. And consistency, the system should display an appropriate level of consistency. Commands and menus should have the same format, and command punctuation should be similar, etc. जिस तरह मैंने आपको ऑफिस की एग्जांपल दी थी, या अक्रॉस द आप डिफरेंट एप्लीकेशंस देख लें. Every application or most of the application, desktop application that we use, they would have a file menu, they will have an option menu, they will have a help menu, so there are certain standards that they have certain consistency, and that is within the applications, and that is across applications as well. You can also that is very obvious. And then minimal surprise, we already saw कि आपके application कोई भी user को surprise ना दे, ठीक है? So if a command approach, what do we mean by that? Let's quickly have a look at this again. If a command operates in a known way, the user should be able to predict the operation of comparable commands, ठीक है जी? And then we have this recoverability. The system should provide some resilience to user errors and allow the users to recover from errors. ठीक है? This might include an undo facility. जिस तरह आपने अक्सर देखा होगा कि जब हम ऑफिस के अंदर टाइप कर रहे होते हैं, तो we make lots of mistakes. ठीक है? Normally we try to type very quickly, and in every line we write, we have lots of mistakes. Now Word, it has different facilities to recover from or fix those errors. Okay, either we can do undo, and you can start doing it again, or in Word we have different kind of spell checks, and it also checks the grammatical errors and stuff like that. So it has built in lots of those ways to actually detect that. और it is very common, आपके जितने भी email editors हैं, for example आप Gmail को use करते हुए अपनी email लिख रहे हैं, ठीक है, ये जितने भी email तो उसके अंदर भी they actually tell you कि if you are making some spelling mistakes, ठीक है, और you have the feature to actually undo and start doing it again. So these applications, they have thought of this recoverability. Now imagine कि अगर ये ऑफिस बनता और इस ऑफिस के अंदर आपको माइक्रोसॉफ्ट ऑफिस के अंदर जब आप एक डॉक्यूमेंट टाइप कर रहे हैं माइक्रोसॉफ्ट वर्ड के अंदर, तो आपको ऑप्शन ही ना होती कि आप उस चीज़ को जाके सही कर सकते हैं, ठीक है. नाउ दैट वुड हैव बीन हॉरिबल, ठीक है. सो इसलिए दैट वाज समथिंग दैट वाज वेरी क्रिटिकल टू एक्चुअली सक्सेसफुल completion of that product. Okay, Ji. Then we have this user guidance. Some user guidance such as help systems and online manuals, etc. should be supplied, which I already told you about. Okay, at times you have proper user trainings. For example, you have make an application for a customer, then you will invite all the different end users, all the different categories of end users, and then you will train them on your application. Okay, and you might provide them some user manuals, and there might be some help menus in your application which will guide them through different windows or through different interfaces. Then we have this user diversity. Interaction facilities for different types of users should be supported. For example, some users have seeing difficulties, so large text should be available. Okay, now if I was actually using Windows 8 the other day, now it has one feature which allows you to magnify the windows. Okay, so for example, you're using a projector and you have very large audience, and you have written something which is relatively small, and you want it to be visible to everybody, to all the people. Some people, they might use some glasses, and they would like to view text bigger, so you can use that magnifier to actually make the text bigger. So that is keeping in mind user diversity. What do we mean by user system interactions? Okay, Ji. Two problems, they must be addressed in interactive system design. And what are these problems? Number one is, how should information from the user be provided to the computer system? ठीक है, कि for example I will give some commands to my application. How will the application accept those commands? ठीक है, and how should information from the computer system be presented to the user. ठीक है, दो ही चीज़ें होती हैं. मैंने आपको जिस हमने when we covered our lectures on data flow diagrams, तो at that point even we discussed कि कोई भी आपकी computer application है या कोई भी computer software है, वो it takes some data and it transforms some data in a certain way and it gives some data to the user. ठीक है, तो user interaction के भी दो ही problems हैं जो कि अभी हमने देखे हैं कि for example, you imagine this is Bubble is your application, then the user is sending some information to this computer system and then something is displayed to the user. ठीक है, तो how will user send this information and how this information will be presented back to the user. Now, these are two important problems of user system interaction. Okay, now and again, user interaction and information presentation may be integrated through a coherent framework such as user interface metaphor. Okay ji. And what are the different interaction styles? Okay, that was the second thing that we will be covering in today's lecture. Okay, what are the different interaction styles? ठीक है, and number one is direct manipulation. ठीक है, number two is menu selection. ठीक है, direct manipulation mean that there would be certain options और आप उनके अंदर कुछ कर रहे हैं, you're directly doing stuff. And then there is menu selection. Then you have form fill-in. Then you have command language. That's another interaction style. And then you have natural language. Okay. So we have these 5 interaction styles or 5 ways in which the user can interact with the application. So these are the different interaction styles and now we'll look at them one by one. Okay, so what are the different advantages of direct manipulation? Number one is that the user feels in control of the computer and are less likely to be intimidated by it. ठीक है, and user learning time is relatively short. ठीक है, क्योंकि आप यूजर को डिफरेंट ज़्यादा ऑप्शंस ही नहीं दे रहे. ठीक है, he can directly manipulate with the application and he will get something out of it. ठीक है, and the user he gets immediate feedback on their actions, so mistakes can be quickly detected and corrected. Okay जी. इसकी बड़ी अच्छी सी एग्जांपल इस तरह से दी जा सकती है कि आपने ये मोटरवेज के ऊपर डिफरेंट वो देखे होंगे बूथ्स. ठीक है, जब आप जाते हैं फॉर एग्जांपल यू आर गोइंग ट्रैवलिंग फ्रॉम इस्लामाबाद टू लाहौर, तो आपको जब आप एंटर हो रहे होते हैं मोटरवे के ऊपर तो दे स्टॉप यू एंड दे गिव यू अ टिकट, दे गिव यू अ टिकट, और आप जब एग्जिट कर रहे होते हैं तो आपको उसके अगेंस्ट पैसे पे करने पड़ते हैं. ठीक है, तो एट दैट मोमेंट जब इफ यू लुक एट द एप्लीकेशन दैट द पर्सन इज यूजिंग, तो दैट एप्लीकेशन इज रिलेटिवली सिंपल. उस एप्लीकेशन के ऊपर देयर इज डायरेक्ट मैनिपुलेशन. ठीक है, देयर आर डिफरेंट इमेजेस जिसके अंदर कहा हुआ कि इफ देयर इज अ कार, तो कार का यहाँ कार की एंट्री का टिकट किस तरह का होगा. ठीक है, उसकी बेसिस के ऊपर द यूजर ही बेसिकली सिलेक्ट्स एन ऑप्शन और then he prints the ticket. So the manipulation is direct. ठीक है, and the reason why the interface is designed in that way, क्योंकि there is a lot of diversity in the number of people and in the experience of the people who will be using that particular application. और उनमें से बहुत से लोग experienced users नहीं है computer के. So that's why the application was designed in a way कि it is very user friendly and it allows or it basically takes input from the user in a very direct way. ठीक है. Okay जी. What are the problems with this direct manipulation? Number one is that the derivation of an appropriate information space model can be very difficult. Given that users have large information space, what facilities for navigating around that space should be provided? And direct manipulation interface can be complex to program and make heavy demands on the computer system. क्योंकि जब आप direct manipulation कह रहे हैं तो आपको सारी की सारी चीज़ें यूज़र को शो करनी है. ठीक है, क्योंकि यूजर कैन डायरेक्टली इंटरेक्ट विद द एप्लीकेशन राइट देन एंड देयर. ठीक है, सो वी डोंट हैव एनी मेन्यूज, वी डोंट हैव लार्ज कमांड्स और एनीथिंग लाइक दैट. सो ऑल द थिंग दैट नीड्स टू बी डन राइट देन एंड देयर. ठीक है, तो इट हैज दीज काइंड ऑफ प्रॉब्लम्स. ठीक है, ओके. नाउ दिस कंट्रोल पैनल इंटरफेस दैट इज एन एग्जांपल ऑफ डायरेक्ट मैनिपुलेशन. ठीक है, इसके अंदर हो क्या रहा है कि फॉर एग्जांपल यू हैव दिस टाइटल, you have method, you have type selection and then you have all the options. ठीक है, अब इसके अंदर जितनी भी चीजें हैं they are written here. Okay, तो imagine that if this you have more information. ठीक है, imagine you have 100 fields and you are trying to design a direct you are trying to have an interaction with the user in this direct manipulation way. ठीक है, तो उसके अंदर there would be lot of problems. ठीक है, user के लिए भी and for you as a designer, that how do you actually display all that information in in a direct way. ठीक है, now this is a problem, लेकिन it is suitable for cases जहाँ पे आपके यूजर बहुत ज़्यादा एक्सपीरियंस नहीं है. ठीक है, they are very novice users, और हो सकता है वो लिटरेट भी नहीं है, लेकिन they have to use an application, तो direct manipulation is the way to go. Okay, and then we have these menu systems. What do we do in this menu system? Users, they make a selection from a list of possibilities presented to them by the system. ठीक है, and the selection may be made by pointing and clicking with the mouse, using cursor keys, or by typing the name of the selection, and may make use of simple to use terminals such as touch screens. ठीक है, इसमें इसकी बड़ी आसान सी एग्जांपल आपकी डिफरेंट हो सकती हैं जो हम एप्लीकेशंस यूज़ करते हैं. उसके अंदर आपको अगर देखो आपकी एक मेन्यू बार होती है जिसके अंदर डिफरेंट मेन्यूज़ बने होते हैं. नॉर्मली यू हैव अ फाइल मेन्यू, यू हैव एन एडिट मेन्यू, you have an options menu, you have a help menu, इस तरह की different चीज़ें होती हैं, and you click them and then you get a whole list. कि for example फाइल के अंदर you have different options. ठीक है, तो इसके अंदर अब क्या हो रहा है कि आपका ये जो हमारा सॉफ्टवेयर है it basically has lots of information. ठीक है, और इमेजिन करें कि इस सारी चीज़ों को अगर हम डायरेक्ट मैनिपुलेशन के अंदर डालते हैं तो that would be a mess. ठीक है, तो देयर इससे हमें पता लगता है कि these different kind of interaction style, they are suited to different kind of applications. Okay जी, so what are the different advantages of these menu systems? User does not need to remember command names as they are always presented with a list of valid commands, and the typing effort it's minimal. ठीक है, क्योंकि user एक mouse को use करते हुए he can basically select different options, and the user errors are trapped by the interface. Okay जी, for example यूजर ने कोई गलत चॉइस कर दी है तो interface will tell this is not possible. Okay जी, and then you have the context dependent help can be provided. For example, the user's context is indicated by the current menu selection. So these are the different advantages of menu systems. ठीक है, पहली बात तो ये कि आपकी typing effort it's very minimal. ठीक है, आप you can use the mouse to actually point to a menu. ठीक है, और the errors that you might make they are trapped by the interface. और यूज़र को कमांड्स वगैरह भी याद करने की ज़रूरत नहीं. ही कैन जस्ट यूज द मेन्यू, और मेन्यू के अंदर वो चीज़ें बड़ी विजिबली लिखी हुई हैं, तो ही डज नॉट नीड टू एक्चुअली रिमेंबर दोज कमांड्स. And what are the problems with these menu systems? The actions which involve logical conjunction and or disjunction are awkward to represent. ठीक है जी, and the menu systems are best suited to presenting a small number of choices. If there are many choices, some menu structuring facility must be used. ठीक है, जिस तरह आपने देखा होगा कि मेन्यूज़ के अंदर भी फिर आगे ऑप्शंस होती हैं. जिस तरह आपका एक मेन्यू है, उसके अंदर फिर आप किसी एक ऑप्शन को सिलेक्ट करें तो एक और सब मेन्यू खुल जाता है, और फॉर एग्जांपल इसके अंदर आप एक ऑप्शन को सिलेक्ट करें तो हो सकता है एक पूरे डायरेक्ट मैनिपुलेशन वाली विंडो खुल जाए. ठीक है, तो देयर आर डिफरेंट थिंग्स दैट यू कैन डू विद दिस यूजर इंटरेक्शन. ठीक है, और नॉर्मली आपके मेन्यू ऑब्वियसली देयर आर लिमिटेड मेन्यू बार के अंदर देयर आर लिमिटेड नंबर ऑफ मेन्यूज दैट यू कैन इंक्लूड. ठीक है, लेकिन उनके अंदर आप उसको यू कैन डू सम स्ट्रक्चरिंग विद इन दोस मेन्यूज टू एक्चुअली हैव और टेक मोर इंफॉर्मेशन फ्रॉम द यूजर. And experienced users, they find menus slower than command language. Okay, this is something very interesting that people, I mean, there are different ways of opening Microsoft Word. ठीक है, जैसा एक तरीका Microsoft Word को खोलने का क्या है कि आप ढूंढें उसका आइकन और उस पर डबल क्लिक करें. ठीक है, I'm just giving an example of experienced user and somebody who is not. The other way of doing it is that you press the Windows key and you press R. उससे आपका जो रन की विंडो है वो छोटी सी खुल जाती है, और आप उसके अंदर सिर्फ उस प्रोसेस का नाम लिख दें. फॉर एग्जांपल MS वर्ड अगर आप लिखेंगे तो आपका माइक्रोसॉफ्ट वर्ड खुल जाएगा. ठीक है, नाउ यू कैन द एक्सपीरियंस पीपल, ठीक है, दे फाइंड इट वेरी कन्वीनियंट टू एक्चुअली टाइप कमांड्स. ओके जी, लेकिन जो आपके होंगे नॉविस यूजर्स, दे वुड वांट टू बेसिकली हैव दीज मेन्यूज क्योंकि they do not want to remember these commands. So these are different problems and we saw the advantages of these menu systems. तो ये जो आपका this is an example of a form based interface. ठीक है, इसके अंदर आप you are putting in a lot of information. So we've seen different problems and we also covered the advantages of these menu systems. Now what do we mean by these command interfaces? Okay, what do we do in user? He types commands to give instructions to the system. जैसे आप लोगों ने Unix या Linux अगर यूज़ किया तो उसके शेल के ऊपर आप different commands लिखते हैं. ठीक है, to actually perform some function. ठीक है, and may be implemented using cheap terminals. easy to process using compiler techniques, and commands of arbitrary complexity can be created by command combination. जिस तरह आपने देखा होगा उसमें different commands को आप मिला के you can create a new command, ठीक है. And concise interfaces requiring minimal typing can be created, ठीक है. जिस तरह बहुत से जो interfaces होते हैं they actually allow you to complete command. जैसे आप DOS के अंदर अगर कोई command लिख रहे हो and you press tab, जिस तरह आप एक folder का नाम लिख रहे हैं तो normally it completes the command for you. So there are different things that can be done to actually minimize the typing effort even in this even when you're writing something on these terminals. So what are the problems with these command interfaces? User have to learn and remember a command language. Command interfaces are therefore unsuitable for occasional users. This is something very important. Okay, somebody who is not familiar with the computers, he would never want to type commands. Okay. So this is something that we need to know. जिस तरह मैंने आपको example दी थी कि even our parents these days they are very familiar with using Skype and they're checking their emails. The reason is because we have these graphical user interfaces for them. If they were to write these things on command prompt and on terminals, they would never use it. And then user make errors in command, and error detection and recovery system is required. ठीक है जी. So basically user जब ये command लिखते हैं तो normally you can make lots of mistakes, ठीक है. और ये this is a must when you have these terminals कि जब भी आप command लिखें तो user को पता लगे कि उसने कहाँ पे गलती की. And more help you give to the user, it makes it a lot easier. जैसे बहुत से जो terminals होते हैं उसके ऊपर आप help लिखें और आगे उस command का नाम लिख दें तो you get lots of help regarding that particular command कि इस command को use करके आप क्या क्या कर सकते हैं. Okay जी. And system interaction is through a keyboard, so typing ability is required. Again, हमने ये पहले ही कह दिया कि this is not for occasional users. This is for experienced users. So, an experienced user, they are very comfortable with typing commands. So, that thing is already covered, I guess. And then we have these command languages. Again, these are preferred by experienced users because they allow for faster interaction with the system. And again, they are not suitable for casual or inexperienced users. May be provided as an alternative to menu commands, keyboard shortcuts. जिस तरह आपको अगर आप Microsoft Office Word को use करते हैं तो there is a shortcut for almost everything. You can copy by doing Control C, you can paste by doing Control V. You can you can get a whole list of जो font के adjustment की, and you can press Control D, then you get a whole window जिसके अंदर आप font को adjust कर सकते हैं. You can you get all other आप subscript कर सकते हैं, superscript कर सकते हैं. You get all different kinds of options with it. And in some cases a command language interface and a menu based interface are supported at the same time. यानी कि you combine these two things. Menu भी है और command based भी है, ठीक है. जिस तरह मैंने आपको word की example दी कि उसके अंदर menus तो होते ही हैं. You have two options. Either you go take a longer path, you use your mouse and you go from one menu to other option and you go there, or you can just use that particular command to get to that function or get to that particular window where you're trying to go. Okay ji. And then finally we have these natural language interfaces. What do the users do? The user, they type in a command in a natural language. Okay, mostly it's English, and generally the vocabulary is limited and these systems are confined to specific application domains, ठीक है. And इसकी वजह क्या है कि आपकी नेचुरल लैंग्वेज जैसा इंग्लिश के अंदर तो बहुत से वर्ड्स हैं, ठीक है. अब अगर आप उसको कंपैटिबल बनाना चाहते हैं कि हर तरह की इनपुट ले ले, ठीक है, then that would require lots of computation, okay, which is not possible. तो हम इसको थोड़ा सा confine कर देते हैं for a certain domain. And natural language processing technology is now good enough to make these interfaces effective for casual users, but experienced users find that they require too much typing, ठीक है. तो we have seen कि जो experienced user हैं they normally prefer these command language and command prompt rather than this natural language and GUI or the menu interfaces. Okay जी. Now these applications, जिस तरह हमने देखा, मैंने आपको पहले भी example दी briefly कि when you make an application तो it can have multiple user interfaces, ठीक है. It can have a graphical user interface, ठीक है, and it can have a command language interface, ठीक है. And for a graphical user interface you need a GUI manager, and for a command language interface you need a command language interpreter, which they basically then communicate with your operating system. So an application, it can have these multiple interfaces. Okay ji. So if you guys remember, there were two questions regarding to the user system interaction जिसमें हमने कहा था कि if this bubble is your application, so we have covered this first part कि यूजर हमारी एप्लीकेशन के साथ कैसे इंटरेक्ट करेगा. वी हैव सीन देयर आर डिफरेंट वेज. डायरेक्ट मैनिपुलेशन से कर सकता है, मेन्यूज के थ्रू कर सकता है, कमांड प्रॉम्प्ट पे कर सकता है, और थ्रू नेचुरल लैंग्वेज प्रोसेसिंग. Okay, and through some command language. And now the second question is, how will this information be presented to the user? How will this be done? So this is the second question. Okay, first of all, let's see what do we mean by this information presentation. So this information presentation that is concerned with presenting the system information or whatever your application has calculated to the end users. Okay, or the information that you want to present, it may be presented directly. For example, the text in a word processor, कि आप कोई चीज़ें टाइप कर रहे हैं and you directly see, आप जो कुछ लिखते जा रहे हैं, you can actually see that. ठीक है, or it may be transformed in some way for presentation. इसकी बड़ी अच्छी examples है कि जिस तरह MATLAB हम यूज़ करते हैं, तो MATLAB के अंदर आप different scripts लिखते हैं, और उन scripts को आप जब लिखते हैं तो you can actually see the equations and all the things that you write in it, लेकिन when you execute it तो you get some graphs out of it. ठीक है, तो you actually have the representation of whatever you're doing in different ways. Okay, ji. Normally, when we talk about information presentation, then you know, we can visualize that the softwares would have, you know, they have something like that. So we have the information to be displayed. ठीक है, for example, आप कुछ लिख रहे हैं, so that is the information to be displayed. And then you have this presentation software, which is a functionality that your application provides, or it lets you represent the information to the user in a number of ways. ये जिस तरह हमने example दी, ग्राफ भी हो सकते हैं. जिस तरह हमने कहा कि आपका MATLAB की एप्लीकेशन है, ठीक है, अब MATLAB के अंदर यू कैन राइट डिफरेंट स्क्रिप्ट्स. ठीक है, और आप उसके अंदर डिफरेंट इक्वेशंस टाइप कर सकते हैं, और आप देख सकते हैं कि अगर ये इनपुट हो तो आपका ये ग्राफ किस तरह का बनेगा. तो एक तो ये है कि आपने एक इसकी एक तरह की प्रेजेंटेशन क्या है, द स्क्रिप्ट दैट यू राइट. दिस इज वन काइंड ऑफ डिस्प्ले और इंफॉर्मेशन प्रेजेंटेशन टू द यूजर. The second kind of is that you can generate different graphs out of it. आप different शक्लों के ग्राफ बना सकते हैं. So that is another way of presenting information to the user. इसी तरह जो हम word processors different use करते हैं, जिस तरह OpenOffice आप use कर रहे हैं, you are typing something in it, or whatever you are typing, the user sees that, you know, whenever he types. ठीक है, तो because that is the functionality of that application, कि it is used for typing. तो जो यूज़र लिख रहे हैं उसको साथ साथ नज़र आता जा रहा है. तो information presentation is handled in different ways. Okay जी. Now this information presentation, it can be divided into two broad categories. We can have this static information presentation, and we can have dynamic information presentation. Static के अंदर क्या होता है, initialized at the beginning of a session, it does not change during that particular session, and it may be numerical or textual. And in the dynamic information, changes during a session, it changes during a session, and changes must be communicated to the system user. It can be numeric or it can be textual. So we will see them in more detail. Okay, what do we mean by static and dynamic information presentation? Okay ji, so that's we are coming towards the end of this lecture. Let's quickly recap of, you know, what we have covered in summarize what we have covered in today's lecture. So we started off by defining user interface. Okay, and we said in the beginning of this lecture that a good user basically associate an application with what they see in it. Okay, they are not concerned with the functionality at the beginning. If a software is friendly to them, or if it looks good to them, they will say, okay, that's a good application, because as a user we do not know how something is implemented in it. Okay, हमें सिर्फ उसका interface ही नजर आता है. So that's what we are interested in. Okay, and then we saw what do we mean by this graphical user interface. And in that I gave you example कि जी आपके graphical user interface के अंदर क्या होता है, you have these different windows, you have icons, you have mouse, you have, you know, you have these different things that you can associate with a graphical user interface. And through this graphical user interface has made our lives much easier, and a lot of inexperienced people who are not computer literates or who are not experienced computer users, even they are able to do lot or use different applications, and even they are able to do their day-to-day work using computers. और हमने देखा कि GUI की characteristics क्या क्या होती हैं. You can associate windows with GUI, you can have icons, you can have menus, you can have pointing, which is through your mouse, or you know, through your if it's a touchpad, then through your hand, and then you can have some graphics in a GUI. और एक और चीज़, ये यूज़र इंटरफेस डिफाइन क्या करती है कि हमारी एप्लीकेशन से यूज़र इंटरेक्ट कैसे करेगा और हम यूज़र को इन्फॉर्मेशन कैसे दिखाएंगे. दैट इज़ द यूज़र इंटरफेस. ठीक है, और एज अ यूज़र I am interested in user interface, not the functionality. As an end user, I want to have an application which has a friendly user interface. Okay, ji. And then another thing that we saw, that whenever we are designing, we want to create design that is user centered. Okay? Why do we say we want to have a design user centered? And what do we mean by that? Okay, when we make an application, so we need to keep in mind that end users, the people who will be using that application, what will be their experience level. Okay? Because if you are making something, for example, as I gave you an example, that if you are making an ERP system for a factory or for a huge enterprise, then the users, they would be of different categories in it. There might be some factory workers who would use that application. There might be some managers or some senior officials who would be using that application. Now, there is a huge diversity in the experience level of different users. So when you make an application, you need to keep that in mind कि एक factory worker उस application को कैसे use करेगा, एक manager उस application को कैसे use करेगा. तो you need to keep those things in mind कि end user जिस तरह का design चाहता है, so end user should be part of that design process when you are making the interface design. इसी से associate हमने जब फिर user interface हमने कहा कि user interface design हमने बनाना है, तो we discussed कि एनालिसिस स्टेज के ऊपर हमने एक तरह की डायग्राम्स पढ़ी हैं which lets out or which basically help us in knowing what kind of an interface the user wants. ठीक है, जिसमें हमने एक तरह की डायग्राम की है जिसको कहते थे यूज केस डायग्राम्स. ठीक है, यूज केस डायग्राम्स हमें क्या बताती हैं कि यूजर्स हमारी एप्लीकेशन के साथ कैसे इंटरेक्ट करेंगे. ठीक है, तो यूजर इंटरफेस डिजाइन प्रोसेस के अंदर हमने क्या कहा था कि क्या क्या एक्टिविटीज होती हैं. नॉर्मली द फर्स्ट थिंग इज दैट यू ट्राई टू आइडेंटिफाई हाउ द यूजर will interact with the application. ठीक, इसकी बेसिस के ऊपर you start making a paper prototype. ठीक है, आप एक रफ प्रोटोटाइप बनानी शुरू करते हैं जो कि आप पेपर के ऊपर डिजाइन करना शुरू करते हैं, और इसकी बेसिस के ऊपर आपका एक आर्टिफैक्ट बन जाता है जिसको आप कहते हैं डिजाइन प्रोटोटाइप. ठीक है, और हम इसे कहते हैं पेपर बेस्ड डिजाइन प्रोटोटाइप. और इस प्रोटोटाइप को आप क्या करते हैं, क्योंकि हमने कहा था हम डिजाइन जो कर रहे हैं दैट इज अ यूजर सेंटर्ड डिजाइन, सो वी वांट फीडबैक फ्रॉम द यूजर. ठीक है, तो इस स्टेज के ऊपर हमें यूजर से फीडबैक लेनी है. हमें अगर तो यूजर इसको एक्सेप्ट कर लेता है, ठीक है, तो वी आर फाइन, बट इफ वी हैव सम रिकमेंडेशन वी विल डू दैट अगेन एंड देन वी पास इट ऑन फर्दर. इस स्टेज के ऊपर अगेन हमने जो डिजाइन पेपर के ऊपर किया हुआ है, वी ट्राई टू make an executable design prototype, and again when we make that executable design prototype we again go back to the user. So that is the definition of user centered design, that user is basically part of this process when you are making this design or when you are making this user interface design. Okay ji. And then following that we covered in today's lecture the user interface design principles. Okay, and these design principles, they tell us that what are the things that we need to keep in our mind when we are designing a user interface. Okay, number one was user familiarity. ठीक है, कि you want to make an interface where people can associate what they do in their normal life with an application. ठीक है, जिस हमने इसकी एग्जांपल दी थी कि अगर आप ऑफिस के लिए, ऑफिस ऑटोमेशन के लिए कोई सॉफ्टवेयर बना रहे हैं, तो we should not use computer words, we should rather use the words that they normally use in their day-to-day routine. जिस तरह अगर हम यूज करेंगे letter, documents and folders, they would be able to associate that. अगर हम directories और identifiers के words यूज करेंगे तो they would say what is this. ठीक है, so when you make an application, you need to keep that in mind that user should be familiar with the terms that you have used in the interface. Then we said that consistency honi chahiye. There should be consistency in the different operations that people can perform using your software. ठीक है, एक जगह पे आप search एक तरह से कर रहे हैं, दूसरी जगह पे दूसरी तरह से कर रहे हैं, that should not be the case. ठीक है, normally for example you are trying to find something at one place, you are finding by control F, and another place this command changes, then user would not be able to actually remember those things. ठीक है, तो there should be consistency for different operations that users can perform in your application. And then the surprise factor in your interface, that should be minimal. ठीक है, for example if I am a user, then I want an application where I can predict the behavior of an operation. ठीक है, if I cannot do that, then I would not remember that. ठीक है, and that would make it difficult for me to use that application. ठीक है, and then there should be some options of error correction and recoverability in your interface. इसकी बड़ी अच्छी सी एग्जांपल है कि आप वर्ड प्रोसेसर यूज कर रहे होते हैं, you make a mistake, then you can undo. ठीक है, you can go back, you can fix those problems. So there is error detection in that, or there is error correction in that. और क्योंकि हमें ये चीज़ ध्यान में रखनी है कि people, they can mistakes, they can commit errors. Then you have this user guidance. that you can provide some user manuals. या बहुत सी applications के अंदर you can see there are help menus, ठीक है, and they give you lots of information, ठीक है, they give you information about certain windows, they give you information about certain features that your application provide or how to use your application. And then you have this user diversity. इस तरह भी हमने जिक्र किया कि you make an application for a big enterprise which have lots of different people, they vary in their experience and they vary in their knowledge of computer usage. So when you are designing a user interface, you need to keep needs of all those people in the mind, otherwise your application will not be a total success. Okay ji. So those were the design principles. Then we came to the very important question of user system interaction, and we saw that when we talk about user system interaction, then there are two questions. Number one is कि user system को input कैसे देगा, that is the first question, and the second question is system उस input को transform करके user को output कैसे present करेगा. So there are two questions. One is of information presentation and the first one is of information retrieval or getting something from the customer. In that the first question के answer में we saw there are different techniques. ठीक है, we covered in fact 6 different techniques. हमने कहा कि जी एक तो आप direct manipulation के through आप user से input ले सकते हैं. Then you have menu based, जहाँ पे आप menus के through. Then you have forms. Then you have these command language. Okay, so 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then we saw you can use natural language to get some input from the users, and then we have one which is I think text based, और इसको हमने कहा था कि terminals या command prompt के through पर आप input ले रहे हैं. ठीक है, text based तो नहीं होगा, we can call it command prompt और terminal based. Okay जी. तो इसके अंदर हमने देखा था कि जो डिफरेंट एक्सपीरियंस के लोग होते हैं, ये फॉर एग्जांपल सम inexperienced people and very novice user, they would prefer direct manipulation or they would prefer menus, ठीक है, whereas people who are experienced, they would prefer command language and they would prefer typing commands on a terminal and things like that. So depending on the experience of people, they prefer different kind of ways to interact with the software. And secondly हमने ये चीज़ भी देखी थी कि an application, it can have multiple interfaces, ठीक है, it can allow the users to give information through some commands, it can allow the users to give the same command using the menu, ताकि different groups को आप कैटेगरी करें कि people who are experienced they can use those commands and people who are inexperienced they can use the menu to use the same to do the same thing. Okay, so you can combine these different things when you're designing the user interface. So that is what we have covered in today's lecture. In our next lecture, that will be a continuation of user interface design. We will be answering the second question, okay, how software present information to the user. Okay? We will be discussing that. Till then, take care and Assalamu Alaikum.